Welcome to episode 88 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. In 2013, Jacob Lemanski set off on a cycle ride that would eventually take him 38,000 miles over 999 days. He's currently retelling the story of that epic ride in his own series of podcasts, but also in Ant Art. After the trailer to his own podcast, Jacob will explain all.
My adventure was an unparalleled modern-day epic, a solo, self-supported bicycle ride spanning 38,000 miles across 6 continents. There were moments I barely survived, and times I cried tears of joy, but mostly this is a story about the thousands of people I met along the way. I moved through their cultures and dramatic landscapes. I ate their food and slept on their land. I was constantly arriving to the open arms of strangers, excited to help me achieve a feat that few could imagine. I did this for years, immersing myself in the world and meeting the people who live here. The story I returned with is a snapshot of humanity captured in a lived experience. Join me for one of the greatest adventures of modern times in this vivid, day-by-day retelling of a bicycle ride twice around the world. Experience the people and cultures, the beautiful landscapes, the danger and excitement, and the inner world of a man trying to push himself as far as he can go. Yeah, my name's Jacob Lemanski. I'm the creator of How to Move the Stars, a bicycle ride twice around the world. And that's a day-by-day retelling of my 1,000-day bicycle tour twice around the world.
Okay, we'll get to that in a second, but before we do, can you give us a bit of background information about Jacob? Where are you from originally? Did you grow up being a cyclist, etc.?
I grew up in the United States on the East Coast, and I was an athletic kid, but I didn't get into cycling until my first bike tour when I was 20. I took a summer between semesters at university and rode across the United States. And I honestly, I knew so little. I bought a bicycle for that trip. I left without a raincoat. I didn't even know how to fix a flat tire. So that was my first introduction into bike touring, but it got me into great shape. And after that, I just stuck with it all through school, and then eventually I graduated with engineering degrees and moved out here to Colorado, where I worked for a few years before being inspired to go on my longer trip.
And so you're an engineer by profession?
Yeah, my background is mechanical and aerospace engineering, and I've designed those signs that flash how fast you're going when you drive past them. That was one of my big projects. The company I was working for most recently, we designed breathalyzers, check people's alcohol content.
Yeah, right, okay. And if you don't mind me asking, how old are you?
I'm 40 today.
You're 40 today?
Well, I'm 40 now.
It's not your birthday?
It's not my birthday today. And when I did my bike tour, I was 29 to 32 is when I was doing that.
Okay, yeah, because you started this journey back in 2013. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So what motivated you to, you were presumably in a job and you were contented being a mechanical engineer. What prompted you to suddenly decide to head off on your bike?
I knew I had one opportunity to see how strong I could be as a young man. And I didn't want to let that opportunity pass. I was 29, and I'd kind of just slowly been pushing myself for years just to see how fit I could be. And I had this idea that if I went off on a bike ride around the world, it'd be so difficult I would quit out there somewhere. And if I quit, then it was clear that's how strong I was. And so I was inspired to go on the trip just to go until I stopped. I didn't really have a destination or a timeline. The goal was simply to see how fit see how strong I could be.
So between making the decision and actually setting off, was it a long period, or was it a matter of a few days, a few weeks, a few months, years?
Yeah, when the idea struck me, it was probably a year before I left. Um, the planning, waiting for the weather, actually convincing myself to quit my job and go do it. It all took a little bit of time.
And did you have all the equipment already? You said you'd done some bike touring before, so presumably you had a bike and all the bits and pieces that you needed.
Um, I upgraded everything, but I did have a bike. I had some experience. In my life to that point, I had done about 3 months of bike touring, so I had a handle on it, and I had the gear. And then I just thought about it and bought everything else I needed to get me along. I had this idea. I wanted to be like a ship at sea. I wanted to bring everything I needed except for food and water with me at the beginning. Um, so that was kind of a fun thing about it, um, to plan it in that way.
So what was the reaction of other people, of friends and family, when you said, "Hey, I'm going to head off on my bike, and I don't really know how long I'm going to be away. It could be months, it could be years." What was their reaction?
My folks weren't super excited about it, but um, no one asked me not to do it. And I think we all understood it's a dangerous thing on some level, but they knew me too well to try and get me to stop. And even to have that idea and to go and try to do it, um, you got to be kind of an oddball, and they knew that about me already.
Were you in any way scared about what you were about to do?
No, I was pretty ignorant about the situation I was getting myself into. And also, I didn't know how far I would go. Like I said, my longest tour before that was 2 months. So when I left, maybe I'd be out 5 months or something. Because at the end of that 2 months tour, I had enough. I was getting kind of bored of it. So when I left on this journey, um, I thought 6 months would be the max for me. And going into it with the idea of spending 6 months on the road is different than going into it with the idea of spending 3 years on the road. It would have just been, um, I don't know, if I knew I was going to be out for 1,000 days, I'm not sure I would have started. But to go for a few months, that's an easier journey to start.
And that 2-month journey that you did before, was that in America?
That was the cross the country tour. Yeah.
Okay. So obviously, going to different countries and having to deal with different languages, very different cultures. Did that play on your mind at all?
Well, it was my first time out of the country. Starting this round the world trip, I flew to Portugal, and I didn't speak any of the languages. Um, but like I said, I just knew so little about what I was getting myself into that I wasn't worried about it. And as far as communicating, I never learned any languages, but I learned to speak with my hands a lot more, and that was the lesson.
If you set off for 2 months, I think the reason probably, I mean, this is certainly the case for me. If I set off for a weekend, or if I set off for 2 weeks, or if I set off for 2 months, my longest trip has been, um, well, I was away for about 6 months, but only about 3.5 months of that was cycling. Because I know at some point, at this point in the future, I'm going to be coming back home. That I think dictates my mood, certainly towards the end of the trip, because I know it's going to be coming to an end imminently. And that helps me keep going, I think, and it helps keep me motivated. I'm not sure how I would cope if I had no endpoint in the back of my mind, even if it was a fairly vague endpoint. To set off and really not have any idea when you were going to be heading back home. Personally, I would find that really difficult. How do you cope with that?
I don't think I had that experience, the same as you described it. For me, because I was out there for so long, um, I learned to be very much in the present. I didn't have anything on my calendar to make me think about the future, to give me some, we're pulling me forward. Um, I was able to just be right exactly in that day. And I existed like that for years, and it was really beautiful. Maybe the most profound part of the whole experience was learning to be really present like that. Um, and then when it did get hard for me was basically, so my route, I started in Europe and I crossed to Asia and I went up to Alaska and bicycled to the southern tip of South America. And then I crossed New Zealand and Australia and then north across Africa as well. And so for me, um, I was able to stay in that very present state all the way to the southern tip of South America. And at that point, I felt like I was heading back home. Um, and that actually became very hard for me because uh, it still took me months and months and months to get there. And I wanted to be home, but I couldn't let myself skip it. And it became eventually so hard that I quit. Like I figured it out there. I went as far as I could. And what got me to stop was it was the return journey. Um, it's like soldiers used to have to walk home from a war, or explorers, once they sailed to the other side of the world, they had to go home at the pace of the wind. Um, it got really hard to have that destination. It was actually much easier for me just to be out there adrift.
How were you actually able to survive in terms of the financial side of it? Did you have enough savings, or were you working along the way?
I had savings. I'd worked as an engineer for 5 years. I had about 60 grand saved up, and I was out there 1,000 days. It cost me $24,000. So there was no end in sight to the money that I had. I could have went another decade, but um, that's another thing allowed me just to be completely present and free out there. I didn't have any financial obligations or any sort of timeline that was ticking down with my money.
Hmm. And were you camping most of the way?
Yeah, I camped. I had a hammock. I would sleep in my hammock as much as I could. Um, the hammocks are great for touring because you don't have to find flat ground. You can sleep on hillsides and you can really sneak into a bushy area as long as there's trees. I of course had a tent as well for where places there was no trees. But I preferred camping, even when people invited me in. Sometimes I'd say no because I'd have to entertain for the night if I got invited in somewhere. So I'm like, I just want my space, and um, it really felt like home out there between the farm fields.
So you initially arrived in Portugal in 2013. What month of 2013 were you in Portugal?
February, I started February. It was rainy. I wasn't really expecting that, but I had a lot of the first 2 months were pretty wet for me.
And in terms of your journey through Europe, I can't really see on the map I've got here. It's kind of it's not enough detail, but it looks as though you headed north at some point to the Netherlands. Is that right?
Yeah, the whole route through Europe was I went down the coast of Portugal and then crossed into Spain all the way to the coast in Medellin, and then I followed the Mediterranean all the way around across northern Italy, and then made my way through Eastern Europe. The branch that goes north that you're seeing at the very end of my journey, I flew back to Europe into Germany, and I biked south down into France. Um, I really knew I was done when I arrived at the border of France for a second time. I'm like, I'm repeating myself. I gotta go home.
Now, obviously, 2013 was a different world, and it looks as though you were able to. Did you cycle through Russia?
Yeah, right where the war's happening. I biked through there. Honestly, the war had started before I'd even finished my journey, so I got there just in time. Same with China. I was in China in 2013. It became a surveillance state around 2014, 15, and I don't think I would have been able just to wander around the way I did.
Hmm, interesting. Um, uh, and then you flew over to Alaska after your travels in Southeast Asia, um, and then you made your way down, well, more or less the west coast of the Americas. Did you actually go back home at any point?
Between the big legs, I did go back home. So from Asia, I went back home, got my bike refitted, waited for the weather to turn, went up to Alaska. From South America, I went back home and I picked up my dad, and he joined me to bicycle in New Zealand for a month. Um, so I did have a, so it's a long time to be away from my family, and they had enough of that. So when I got to the end of a continent, they would ask me to get back home to say hello to everyone.
Were you ever tempted just to say, nope, okay, that's it, I'm not going to continue, I think I've had enough?
Every time I took a day off, I would wonder that. It's so comfortable to be in a hotel with internet and put my feet up. Um, it was always hard to go back to the road wherever I was in the world. Um, but then I would, and maybe within a half a mile, I would think this is actually what I want to be doing. But to have the break, I mean, stopping is always tempting because it's hard to be going for that long.
So talk about some of the high points and also perhaps some of the low points. Where were you in your element? Where were you enjoying it the most?
Down through South America, through the Andes was really a high point for me. I'd been out maybe 600 days, so I was really strong and in a great headspace for it. And those mountains are just so um, profoundly large and beautiful. I rode my bike up to 17,100 feet one night, and I camped up there in the cold. It was very cold. But there's not many places in the world you can get that close to the stars. Um, and the cultures are so different down there, and yeah, it was just a beautiful that was a beautiful time in the whole journey for me, right down through the Andes.
And where was it the most challenging? Where did you have the most problems, or where did you feel the most out of your comfort zone?
The hardest days for in the whole trip were in the Gobi Desert, crossing Mongolia into China. And if I had to do those days again now, I could handle them better. But I was just 7 months into the trip at that point, and I wasn't as confident or as good at what I was doing yet. Um, and basically, it was always I was struggling to find water. I was lost out there. Um, and I didn't do any research. I would just go and figure it out. That I wanted to feel like an explorer. So to look up what was ahead of me just didn't seem to fit. And so I was out there in the Gobi, and it was hard. I was slow. It was a lot of sand. I was biking for 8 or 9 hours just to cover about 40 miles. And I got to the Chinese border. This was going to be I made it. I could start leaving the desert. I could get some food again. China was going to be my savior. And I reached the border, and the security there said that I was at the wrong spot. This this crossing was only for Chinese and Mongolian citizens. And he pointed into the desert, and he said, "You got to go 400 miles that way, and you'll find the one for international uh, passport holders." And man, I just looked off into that desert, and I asked again if I could cross, and he said no, and I just left. What's there to do except to carry on? So, I was just in over my head in several ways out there.
But if you're on a journey of 38,000 kilometers, sorry, miles, 38,000 miles, 400 miles in the great scheme of things is not too disastrous.
You got to convince yourself of that in the moment. And I didn't want to do another 400 miles in the desert. I was ready to be done with it. So, I got my head on straight, and I went for it. And then I made it to the next little town, and I stumbled into this mining camp, and they gave me water. It was a whole ordeal to do that 400 miles. Um, it was the most remote and sandiest terrain I've ever covered. So in the grand scheme of thing, yeah, it was small, but every moment you can only take on in the moment.
I was going to ask you if you had any problems with visas and things like that. Obviously, getting into China was a little bit difficult, but did you have any problems with visas elsewhere?
Russia and China were the only countries I had to pre-arrange visas, and I got like business visas for someone that is traveling a lot. You can have like a 1 year visa for those countries at the time. So those are the only two countries I had to plan ahead. Everywhere else, I could just show up at the border and they let me in. Um, which honestly, it may be a rare time in human history where someone can just wander the whole world like that.
Yeah. If you were to do the journey again, would you follow the same route or would you make significant changes? Obviously, you'd go to that different border crossing in China, presumably. But apart from that, would you actually go any different directions, or would you do it in the opposite direction? Would you go from South to North America? Anything radically different?
Yeah, maybe the opposite direction. I always had this feeling that the experience would be totally different going the other way, just because the view would be different. You just, so while I travel, every once in a while, I just stop and turn around and make sure I'm catching the view in both directions. Um, but as far as a long route like that, I would point one direction and go that way. And if I didn't want to explore one area very much, a lot of places there's not a lot of roads to choose from. So if I'm heading south, there's only a couple options to go south. Um, it's not like in the East Coast U.S. It's like a spider web of roads. You can go any which way you want, but that's just not the case in a lot of countries. So I think the route I took was in a way chosen for me, just because I was heading that way.
Hmm. You said you cycled with your dad in New Zealand. Were there any other segments or sections of your route where you cycled with people? And did you actually meet and travel with any other round the world cyclists when you were traveling?
Yeah, so out of 1,000 days, I think I was alone for about 840 of them. So my dad joined me for a month. I had a girlfriend join me the first 2 months across Europe. I had a different girlfriend join me in the United States for a couple weeks. It was a long trip. The woman I started with, she was married to someone else by the time I finished. um, so I would catch up with people on and off again. I never bicycled with any other around the world cyclists. So I did meet. I mean, we're out there, and like I said, there's not a lot of roads to choose from. So we end up bumping into each other. Um, and I remember there was a guy right at the very end, as I was finishing my around the world trip. I met another man finishing his around the world trip, and we sat on a park bench together in New York City for an hour chatting. And neither of us had thought about what we were doing next. All we were trying to do was make it to the end.
And in terms of the people who you met as you were traveling, not the other travelers, but the people who lived in the places that you were visiting, are there any memorable encounters with people that you could tell us about?
Out there on your bike, you're out with the people. It's kind of a beautiful thing about it. Um, in Africa, I had this really kind experience. I was in the kingdom of Lesotho, which is this little mountainous country in southern Africa, and it's late at night. It's mountainous. There's no trees around for my hammock. I'm looking for kind of a secluded spot for my tent to lay out before the storm comes in. And a goat herder came by and he found me and he invited me to come back to his little yurt with him for the night. And two other herders were there living with him, and they each had about 150 animals, which we together went around and counted to make sure they had them all. And we just spent this night up on this mountaintop. They cooked me goat stew. We watched a storm blow through with lightning and stars came out. It was really a beautiful experience. And we couldn't speak to each other in any language that we shared, but just like a warm meal with people from such a different life is always, um, something to be cherished.
Are you still in contact with anybody who you met along the way? Or are there fleeting encounters that you meet people, then you move on and they're just a memory? Anybody you're still in regular contact with?
There's one guy I met him in Russia, and he's an Austrian man, and he was bicycling to Eastern Russia, and we biked together for a week, and then he had carried on, and I went my route, and sometime later we met up again in Alaska. So he and I ended up biking together for maybe 6 weeks in total in two different places. Um, and I keep up with him, and he lives in Austria, so one day I hope to see him again. But um, it's they're long distance relationships, so they only get so close, I guess.
Hmm. Now it's is it a decade since you returned? It's 2025 now, so 9 years since you returned. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
And you're beginning to retell the story of your 3-year journey in a series of podcasts. And if I can understand correctly, you're breaking the story down into daily chapters and retelling the story on a daily basis. Is that correct?
Yeah, I kept a journal while I was out there. Just as well, it started off, I was sending it to that girlfriend that I started the trip with, and then it started a habit. And I just kept writing. So I returned home with a day by day. I returned home with my journal, which had the whole story, and but it was just a rough first draft, and I started rewriting it. I had this idea that I would make a book out of it, but the journey was so big and so profound. I couldn't figure out how to tell it in a shorter way. So I just started editing my journal, and I've been writing it for 9 years now. I've been editing, and basically turning myself into a better writer. The journal was just a rough draft, and as I worked on it, I've condensed it into each day is like a well told little short story. And so the goal of it is to bring people to that moment that I quit. Like that'll be one of the most profound moments in my life, and to um, take people along that journey the entire way with me. um, I think maybe someone will, if they listen to the whole thing, will be able to understand it in some way, and then I won't feel so alone in this experience of having circled the earth twice and gone as far as I possibly could. So that's the idea. I want people to understand it.
Yeah, I've listened to a few of them, and they're very engaging things to listen to. You tell the story of what happened on that particular day, but there's also quite a bit of thinking in there, a bit of philosophy, a bit of reflection on the encounters that you have. It's more than just a dry retelling of the story.
Well, part of my goal is to get very far out on that trip. Um, and yeah, in the retelling, to listen to the whole thing, you're going to see me um, become a person that has spent 3 years alone on a bicycle, and um, the storytelling changes by the end. I'm talking about some weird stuff by that point. It's a lot of time to be alone, um, and to tell it day by day. Little things like when I'm in the desert, I obsess about water, and you'll hear that every day. I'm talking about water, and then as soon as I get to somewhere with rain and rivers, I don't mention it at all. So just little things like that will pop up um, as the listener explores the world with me.
Now I'm looking at the YouTube version, and you've got to day 33. Is I know there are two versions. There's the audio version. There's also the YouTube version. Uh, is the audio version also currently on day 33?
Yeah, the audio and video versions are the same. The video will just give you the route. I just have a Google Maps flyby basically. So you get to see the villages and the mountains and the terrain that I crossed that day, as well as photos of that day will pop up in the video.
Yeah, and they're quite manageable chunks because they're only a couple of minutes long each video or each audio. So they're in terms of a time commitment for somebody listening or watching, it's not a great time commitment, but they are, as I say, very engaging little snippets of the journey that you took. It looks to me as though you're producing one of these once every 2, 3, 4 days. So basically, it's going to take you. Trying to do the maths in my head. It's going to take you about 10 years to retell the entire story.
Exactly. That's the idea. Um, I met a couple. I was in Alaska, and they wrote on my blog, "Nice to meet you. Good luck." And then a year later, they're on my blog again, and they're like, "Wow, you're still out there. Keep going. South America looks great." And then, another year later, they're like, "What are you still doing out there? We met you so long ago." And I want to give people that experience too. Like the this was a long, long journey, and if I want to bring people to the point that I quit and have it mean something, I need them to be on that long journey with me. Um, so yeah, it comes out twice a week, and it'll be a 10-year story.
And the Jacob who set off in February 2013 compared to the Jacob who arrived back in Denver, Colorado in 2016. What was the difference between those two people?
I remember I was almost home, and I was worried that I had become unrelatable, that my experience was unrelatable, and that how I was in the world had become odd as well, because it's a long time to exist without human mirrors to tell you you're doing something right or wrong. So in that time, I became exactly myself, is how I put it. And I was visiting a friend just before I got home, and I explained all this to him, and he said, "You know what? You were weird before you left too." And that kind of made me feel better about the whole thing.
So you were weird before you left and you were still weird when you came back, which is quite reassuring, I suppose.
Yeah. In different ways, but I came back. W- one thing that really did change for me out there is I just learned to see the beauty in everything, and the poetry and everything. And I came back, and it was hard to admit at the time, but I would call myself an artist now. So I left an engineer, I came back an artist. If that explains anything.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that actually in a second. But if you were to give advice to the 2013 Jacob, what would you advise him to do before setting off? Or as he set off, what advice would you give him?
Um, I would just tell him to pay attention. It's going to be a profound experience, and just try to suck in as much of it as possible.
Now, are you working still as an engineer? Because I know you have other sidelines now, but are you still in the engineering world?
I've stepped out of engineering. 2 years ago, I opened a venue in an art gallery with the art that I created following my bike ride. Um, so that, it's the artwork itself. While I traveled, the only thing I missed was this ant farm that I had left at home. I missed it like a pet.
You're gonna. I mean, I saw that. I saw that on your website. Now, this is not a concept I'm familiar with. What is an ant farm?
So in the U.S., it's a kid's toy. It's a habitat for ants. It's about a half an inch thick, and maybe 12 inches by 8 inches. So it's like a sheet of paper in size. And then there's sand between two panes of glass. And as you stick ants in there, and as the ants tunnel, you can see their tunnels forming up in the sand. So an ant farm is a children's toy.
Do you have to feed them?
Yeah, you can feed them some sugar, you can feed them some grains, you know. Basically, they don't eat anything though. If you were to stick a piece of corn in there, it would get moldy before they ate it. And there's no queens in there. A queen would have thousands of babies. It's kind of too many. So you just put workers in there, and they'll live in there for a while, and they'll dig tunnels, and then they die, and then you clean it and start it over. And it's just like, it's a little science experiment for children. Um, but I had one as a child too, and I liked it enough to build myself one as an adult. And then when I traveled, I missed that thing, and so I got home and, um, just in the way I had taken a bike ride to its extreme limit, I settled on that ant farm, and I did the same thing with that. And I ended up building, the size of a sheet of plywood, a huge ant farm, two panes of glass. I built a frame around it. Within the frame, there's lights which illuminate a background. The background is a nebula. So it's this illuminated space nebula that shines out through the tunnels as the ants dig and they create this artwork. And the ants will live in there for a year. So it's this living art piece that's always changing on your wall. Um, they're, you know, I've never seen anything like them before. They're far out. They're really interesting. And I built these. This is how I integrated the experience of biking around the world. I threw all my creative energies into, um, building giant ant farms. It was a wild time in my life.
If you am I correct in thinking that these, if I'm looking at the website antlife.space, and and that is what I can see, the pieces of art on there are made by ants, and you are shining lights through the panes of glass, and that is creating the art, correct?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And are there still ants living in there, or are they now dead? And
Yeah, it starts half full with soil. You fill it yourself, and then you put the ants in, and they pick up a piece of sand from somewhere and set it down somewhere else, and they dig about a half an inch an hour. And it's not much to sit and watch them, but you go to bed and you wake up, and there's a couple of inches of tunnels there, and then you come home from work, and it's a little bit more, and after a month, the whole thing is dug up. And then the ants will live in there about a year, just kind of slowly dying off, and then you clean it and restart it at the end.
okay, and can you? I mean, I don't want to stretch the metaphor too much, but can you see parallels in the life of the ants in your pieces of art, and perhaps what you did in terms of the cycling journey?
Yeah, there's tons of those. It's an art piece that only exists in the present. It's always changing, and that's something I learned to do on the bike ride. I learned to really exist in the present. Another thing, you stick those ants in there, and they start to tunnel. There's no way to speed them up. Just like a bike tour, it's slow. It's going to take time. You just have to accept that. Um, so yeah, it's fun too. They're fun art pieces to stare into and think about all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I would imagine it's likely that people listening to this are probably scratching their heads, so thinking about what actually you're talking about. So I think the best thing for them to do is to go to antlife.space, and they'll find examples of what you've just been talking about. Um, am I right in thinking you also organise bike tours in Colorado?
That's right. With the launch of my podcast, I'm also leading bicycle tours for people that want to experience Colorado and come do a ride with me. Um, because we're in the mountains here, I'm doing e-bikes. Partly because we'll do passes at 12, 13,000 feet high. So the elevation is hard for people coming from lower. Um, as well, it's in the mountains, it's a long distance between the towns just because there's not a lot out there. So the e-bikes allow us to do, 90-mile days through the mountains without without having to be younger and fitter.
Yeah, because I remember talking to Ryan Doozer quite a few years ago for the podcast, and he lives in Boulder, or is based there certainly. And I remember talking to him. I'm looking at the map now. Uh, Colorado is kind of almost divided into two, isn't it? You've got the eastern side, which looks like it's just flat plain. It certainly does on Google Maps. And then you've got the western side, which is that's the start of the Rocky Mountains. Yeah.
Yeah, basically they rise right up out of the plain. Yeah, it's true. And once you're in them, that's it's all up or down. There's no flat in there. And there's some beautiful, there's some beautiful high passes to do. Um, Snowy mountains. Yeah, it's really some of the most beautiful terrain I've ever bicycled through. I just love biking in the mountains, and the Colorado Rockies are top notch. So um, I want to, give people some of the experience of bike touring that I fell in love with. And so I lead day long tours, 3 day tours, and week long tours just here in the mountains. And that's with my company, Mountain High Bicycle Tours.com.
Yeah. And I think for people living in Europe, I think we sometimes forget just how sizable American states are. Most American states are probably the size of your average European country. So within the very straight borders of Colorado, you've got a lot there, I would imagine, in terms of the variety of the terrain, not just that eastern side, which looks fairly flat, and the western side, which looks pretty mountainous. I would imagine within those areas, you've also got a great deal of variety in terms of terrain that you can explore. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. To drive across the state is 6 or 7 hours. So you can compare that to countries in Europe. Yeah, we have the plains, we have the foothills, we have the high mountains. It's deserty here, so it's good weather for biking since it's warm and dry.
And Colorado, I think, again, from a European perspective, America doesn't always have the best of reputations in terms of certain aspects of America. However, Colorado, Denver, Boulder, Aspen, those kind of places, they do have very positive images, I think, in the minds of probably most European people. Do you think that Colorado is a kind of an America which is a bit different from the rest of America?
Yeah, it's a lot of outdoorsy people here, and also a town like Aspen, Boulder. These are um, beautiful, scenic ski towns in the mountains. There's a lot of money there. These are it's full of second homes, and with all that extra money, they build bike paths everywhere. So they're great for biking and subsidized by some of the wealthiest people in the country. But that's the way it is.
Well, a bike path is a bike path. I suppose it doesn't really matter who's paying for it ultimately. If it's a bike path, then so be it.
That's how I feel about it. Yeah.
Have you got any more big trips planned, or is that kind of, I've done my 999 days. I'm never going to do it again. Or do you think, perhaps not 3 years, but have you got any big trips planned?
Yeah, doing that big trip, it took it out of me so much that I wasn't sure if I'd ever bike tour again. I came home and I kind of ended up living in a garage, which it felt most comfortable being like half outside and half inside with my garage door open. Um, and it's been 9 years since I got back, and only just now am I feeling like I could think about doing another big trip again, something of several months. Um, but I don't have anything planned. I'm doing my bike tours here in Colorado, so really I'm excited just to, you know, have some people to go bike with.
Yeah. Well, I think I think what you've done is commendable. Take my hat off to you cycling for 3 years, but also I think the way in which you're now looking back upon those experiences all these years later, and with your art, with your tours, and with your podcasts and your video podcasts, I think you're doing exactly the right thing in hopefully engaging some more people to be inspired by what you did, and perhaps even set off on their own epic journeys around the world. If people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way of doing so?
Go to howtomovethestars.com, and that'll get you to a place where you can find all my other things. I was going to say that the name How to Move the Stars, that comes from when I was up in Alaska, I can find a North Star, and it's in Alaska, it's right over my head. It's really high in the sky. And as I traveled south, that North Star dropped to the horizon, and then the Southern Cross came up. So just by pedaling, I was moving the stars in the sky.
That, I think, is a perfect place to end our conversation. So thank you for that, Jacob. Thank you for your fascinating retelling of your tale around the world, and good luck on your future cycling and non-cycling adventures.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
This has been episode 88 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Jacob for telling his story. You can visit his website at howtomovethestars.com and find out all about his podcasts and his art and his rides in Colorado. If you'd like to get in contact with your own story, then you'll find all the contact details at cyclingeurope.org/contact. And if you'd like to help support the podcast, you can find all the details as to how to do that at cyclingeurope.org/support. So thank you to Rob Ainsley, as always, for not just composing, but playing the music. I'll be back very soon with episode 89. In the meantime, thank you for listening, and happy cycling.